Hi, everyone. Welcome to this really important conversation about going back to school for LGBTQ youth in particular, in the context of what's happening across the country at the state level and how it affects children and families, educators, and everyone who cares about the well-being of LGBTQ youth. My name is Ellen Kahn. I'm the Senior Director of Programs and Partnerships for the HRC Foundation. And I have the honor in my role of working very closely with programs across the foundation that help promote school safety and inclusion in K-12 education and supporting LGBTQ youth generally. And in the last few years, really focusing on the specific experiences and needs of trans and non-binary students. So as you know, this is the time of year when students are going back to school. Many already started. I think some just today in New York started, but generally this is what we call back to school season. And we're talking about what it means for LGBTQ students to be going back to school and how parents and teachers and policymakers and allies can show support for LGBTQ students. This has been a really tough, really couple school years now for LGBTQ students and all students. And we want to create welcoming environments. We want to really support one another. We want LGBTQ students to know that they are cared for and that we have their back. So we're going to talk about what it looks like to have equity inclusion in the classroom, but also how we create an equitable landscape through laws and policies so that our students can thrive every day. And I'm excited to welcome some wonderful friends and colleagues to have this discussion with me. And I'm going to introduce them, and then we're going to jump into a conversation with everyone. So today I'm joined by Lisette Trujillo and her son, Daniel. Lisette has been a part of HRC's Parents for Trans Equality Council for several years, and her son, Daniel, is the reason she does this work. My colleague, Jason Starr, who is the litigation director at HRC, and my colleague, Kate Oakley, who is the state legislative director and senior counsel at HRC. So welcome and thank you for joining me for this conversation. I know many folks are talking about this in the, at their kitchen tables and maybe in offices at schools or in parent support groups. And we're going to talk about it with many more folks and get a little deeper. So I'm going to start with a question to you, Lisette. So this has been, as I mentioned earlier, a year and a half or so, not like any other. We've had a presidential election. We're living through a pandemic. We've seen many really hateful bills introduced in state legislatures across the country. At the same time, families like yours are just navigating everyday life, celebrating birthdays, getting kids ready for school, working, carpooling. So can you reflect a little bit on just what it's like right now to be a parent, and a parent in particular of a trans kid in this moment?
I like to joke around that I've been tired for the last 6 years. Daniel began social transition in 2015. And so having to deal with the previous administration was exhausting, but we were starting to see so much visibility and seeing kids really loved and affirmed by their parents, and seeing this beautiful network of parents nationwide kind of step up in a way that hadn't been done before. And so it's like this year has been exhausting, but we're also seeing like strides on the ground. And so it's this weird kind of experience of knowing that we're making progress while feeling the stress and the kickback from legislators and lobby groups and hate groups that really want to stop progress from moving forward. And so we're seeing our kids happy and thriving, and also experiencing the fear of what does it mean if they actually pass sweeping legislation across all the 28 states that they really tried to, and preparing ourselves for what the next leg session looks like. And so I would use the word exhausting, and still trying to find those pockets of joy.
Well, I have a little pocket of joy right next to you. So Daniel, I'll ask a similar question to you. What has this last year and a half been like for you? And what's it like to go back to school, especially going back to school as a trans kid?
I feel very lucky to be in a safe and supportive home and school, but it would be awful to have my rights to play sports and to be in a supportive school
Taken away from me.
Yeah, taken away from me. There's so much for me. There's so much more to me than being transgender. I love science, art, social studies, and playing basketball. I should be seen for those things instead of just my transgender identity.
So, Kate, I know you have had a heck of a year being one of the folks at HRC who is nose down in trying to fight these bills. So can you say a little bit about what this last little stretch has been like for you?
I can. And Lizette, thank you for previewing some of this, because I think that the part of this that is the most important is the impact that these bills have on people. I think that sometimes legislators are so wound up in what they think that they're doing or what they hope that they're doing that they look past the impact on real people. And it's part of our job to try to make sure that people do understand what that is. But also my heart goes out to everybody who has been feeling like these are bills that are regulating their own lives and their livelihoods and their families. And there's a lot of fear that's been engendered by this incredible onslaught of anti-LGBTQ legislation. This year, we tracked several hundred bills, as we always do, and we opposed more than 250 bills in 40 states. And these include, in particular, an onslaught of anti-transgender bills, with more than 130 of those introduced. And just for some context, last year, we had fewer than half of that many bills, and last year had been a record until that time. Even in 2016, the year of HB2 in the bathroom bill in North Carolina, we had fewer anti-transgender bills filed that year than we had filed even last year. And then, of course, we more than doubled that number this year. And so if this is an issue that you're following, it was an exhausting year. I think exhausting is exactly the same adjective that I would use, which is, we've been feeling like we've been playing whack-a-mole on these bills for several years, right? And that our opposition puts forward a new kind of bill that they're going to try to use to claw back LGBTQ equality. And, in 2015, 2016, those were largely around marriage. They were around trying to prevent marriage, trying to pull pieces of marriage apart and away, trying to create exemptions to when people had to acknowledge same-sex marriages. And as that issue started to feel, I think, lost for our opposition, they pivoted to attacking trans people. And that's how we got HB2 in North Carolina in 2016. And the incredible blowback from not only HB2, but then also the failure of Texas to pass a bathroom bill in 2017 in both the regular session and the special session. There was just all of this pressure, and our opposition pivoted again. Why am I explaining all of this? Well, because I think it's really important that people understand the background to all of this. It's not like trans kids dropped out of the sky last year for the first time and raised their hand and asked to receive medical care and sports and play sports alongside their peers. It's not like that happened for the first time last year. And yet we've seen this absolute onslaught of legislation in the last 2 years. So what changed? Well, what changed, and as Lizette previewed this, what changed is that our opponents of LGBTQ equality thought this was the place that they could finally succeed. They've been failing and failing and failing. And it's incredibly discouraging to have to continue to play whack-a-mole, to have to run around and say, actually, that's not what being a trans kid is. Actually, that's not what being a trans kid is about. Actually, you're making things up. This is misinformation, and some of it's downright lies, and all of it is scare tactics. And for us to have to get in front of that and do the education And that's been a huge challenge. And it's a huge challenge for us. Of course, it's also our job. So we're going to keep on plugging away. And we're already in preparations for how we're going to make sure that we are prepared for next legislative session and that we are able to meet that challenge. And in the meantime, I think it's really important, everything that Lizette and Daniel just said, to really remember that there are people on the other end of this conversation, and to not ever let us get distracted from that the people on the other end of this conversation are the reason that we're all here doing the work.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think it's important to note that our opposition have a complete disconnect of heart and soul to people like Lisette and Daniel and some of the families Jason's been working with. And I'm going to pivot to Jason. We're really trying to show that there is a connection between everyday experience a student like Daniel has walking in the halls of school, everyday experience his mom Lisette has in accessing healthcare and other support for him, and what's happening in our state capitals and in our courtrooms. So Jason, you're leading some of our newer work with impact litigation. And I know that you're working with a couple families who are, taking on these bills because it is a direct harm to their lives. Can you say a little bit about your work and maybe some of the folks you've met through doing this work?
Absolutely. It's great to be here. And I love, Kate, how you said this work really builds on starting with, the lived experiences of those who are walking through these realities on a state by state, community by community, school district by school district level. And so in our impact litigation work, we take those fights to the court. I'm a lawyer by trade, but I'm an educator at heart. I spent 3 years as a high school teacher in South Florida. So I come to the work as a lawyer, but also understanding, what being in schools is like and can be when those environments, when we fight for those environments to be welcoming, affirming, and equal, like they should be. And so we had a really rough year. That's correct. 24 pieces of legislation passed. But I always think it's important to look at the denominator because there were over 250 that were introduced. And it's because of the work of folks like Kate and Ellen, and because of you, Lizette and Daniel, that the bench has been built so we can have a resistance. And so after session, the work pivots to the courtroom. We're going to show up and we're going to challenge those bills that did become law. The environment is rough in some of the places in which we're litigating. Tennessee and Florida, particularly for us, those fights aren't going to be easy. We're representing a 13-year-old girl, Daisy, and her parents in Florida. She's played soccer for so many years at her school, on a club team where she travels with, on her neighborhood recreation team. She's good. She practices hard. She finds a lot of community and friendship. The only thing she loves more than soccer is Katy Perry. And she's taken on, her and her family have said, we're going to do what we have to do. This is a rough environment, but we have a good support system. We've created a good support system for our children. And they see this as just the next step in doing what any parent would do for their kid. And it's suing the state of Florida. And we want to be right there every step of the way. Same thing in Tennessee. Alex and Ariel, one starting first grade, one starting ninth grade, all of the excitement of all of that, but counterbalanced with issues not only relating to being able to use the restroom in alignment with their gender identity, but the politics of mask and COVID, and really having to figure out how to be, just a kid who's trying to get to math, or who's trying to figure out recess, or excited about the possibility of what going back to school means after such a tough year, kind of having to be containers for that. We know the environment out there is uncertain. These were laws that were purported solutions in search of problems that didn't exist, that created problems. Who's enforcing the law? Is the situation today going to be the same as the situation tomorrow? What can I expect sending my young person into this environment, my love into this environment? Who's going to be there to protect them? And in our litigation work, we want to say, we know it's slow work. We know the fights in court can be long, but what we are committed to is being there to help answer those questions for you. We don't know them all. Some of them we're learning as life happens, but you're not alone out there in answering those questions and figuring out what the law is and making sure we use all the tools that we need to do to protect you today, to protect you tomorrow, and to protect you into the future, no matter what the legal circumstances might be that you're living under.
Thanks so much, Jason. When you're talking about Daisy and these other young people, I was thinking, you're just trying to go to school every day and navigate friendships and peer groups. And so it brings me back to Daniel. So you're back in school, you're going in person now. So you're back in touch with friends. I don't know sort of how out you are or, with whom you're out at school as being trans and whether there are other LGBTQ students, but can you say a little bit about what it's like to be among peers and friends, and would you say that your peers have a sense of some of the sort of challenges and hostility that's been facing trans kids in particular, and whether they discuss that and your sense of how that sort of trickles into your own peer group?
Well, at my school, there's I'm friends with a lot of other LGBTQ kids, and but with that, there's also a lot of transphobic kids at our school too. And actually, like last week, there was an experience my friend had where some kid was asking why everyone looked like the opposite gender. And my friend, being a trans man, was like, well, there's a lot of trans people now. And then this kid was like, nope, that's not real. And so then, but because my friend is openly out, I'm pretty sure. Same with me at school. It's just easy to go to my friend group and then we laugh about it and then we don't focus too much on it anymore. Because we're like, no, not true.
Right.
And so it's easier to just move on and to not have to focus on it too much. And I think that having more supportive friends, more supportive friends or just LGBTQ friends in general at school makes it easier to deal with that.
And I think Danielle and I have talked about the importance of having like staff be supportive, having supportive policies in the school and in the district allow for kids to feel like they can be out even if they're not out at home, right? So that gives them a place to feel like they can be visible and not feel the pressures that they may feel at home in their learning environment. And so although they feel bullied or they experience microaggressions, they're able to rely on each other. And I find that that's been such an important part of his experience in school and his feeling like he can continue to thrive there.
Yeah. I mean, generally, we see from research that, younger people, middle school and high school age students are, have pretty favorable attitudes and are pretty accepting and inclusive. I think most of our work is really with the adults. The person, Daniel, you described who said, no, that's not real. My hunch would be that that person hears something that maybe is coming from Fox News in the background or something like that. So I'm glad to hear that you're generally having a good experience. Lizette, just to build on that from the parent experience, so you're part of our, Parents for Trans Equality Council. You're connected to parents not only in Arizona, but all over the country. What are some of the things you're hearing from parents, especially parents of trans kids who are, maybe having, where our breath is still shallow, where we're not out of the woods and we still worry a lot about our kids every day?
Yeah, just to echo what you said, Ellen, it's definitely like the parent sentiments, right? Like you're seeing adults be very vocal in this moment around trans rights, LGBTQ rights, around Black Lives Matter, and talking about these social justice issues that are at the forefront. And what I find with families of trans youth is that there's a deepening awareness of how their children's lives intersect with BIPOC communities, and really having to really grasp what systemic oppression looks like, As I've mentioned before in many of the conversations you and I have had, Ellen, as a first generation Latinx mother who is raising a trans child in a state in the Southwest that was not always friendly to is not friendly to immigrants, Mexicans, Indigenous people, Black people, and we have a sad history here in the Southwest regarding all of that. It's exhausting to then move into this space and realize that now you have to fight a little bit harder even though you thought you already were paving a way forward for your kids. And what I find is that we are in a space with families of trans youth where they might be experiencing like a deep understanding of what the loss of privilege is, and really having to grapple with what this means for their kids when you're talking about systemic oppression and talking about the ways in which policies are created to hold people back. And so I think we're in a time when it's scary and overwhelming, and people feel like they don't have their footing because they're learning at the same time, what does this mean and where do I fit? I think it's a lot of fear, but trying to hold it together day to day, because we have to work, we have to get our kids to school, we have to keep thriving in spite of. And I'm like, welcome to my life, because I've been thriving in spite of for a long time. And so I think that we're in a space of learning. And I hope that learning continues. And I hope that parents of trans youth continue to look at this as an intersectional issue, that we have to be fighting for all people and fighting for our kids, and really pushing for equality in its true meaning, in its fullness.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I know we talked the other day about how some of the same folks who are terrified of like telling the truth about, the history of, slavery, for example, like telling the actual truth, or including comprehensive sexual health ed, like it's, the same forces who want to, who are behind some of these anti-trans bills. And so we, everyone who is inclined toward fair-minded equity, inclusion, we would hopefully engage them more in understanding the impact of anti-LGBTQ legislation. And turning back to that topic, Kate, so we talked a lot about, this unprecedented number of bills and the impact it's having on families. You have your finger on the pulse of all of the states, and I'm wondering if there might be some things that you see that give you some hope in terms of advancing equality for LGBTQ students and youth.
Yeah. Well, and to the point that Ellen, that you and Lisette were just making about these issues all being connected, we've also seen this year, of course, this incredible number of bills that are trying to prohibit the teaching of what they're calling critical race theory in schools, right? And so if folks on our side have a hard time understanding how these things are connected, I assure you that our opponents have no difficulty understanding how these things are connected. And to your point, Ellen, it is very much the same folks who are pushing the anti-LGBTQ, particularly the anti-trans bills, as well as the critical race theory bills, and a lot of the other really terrible legislation that we saw in states across the country. And, what I'll say about, I think, the weird, I don't even want to call it a silver lining, because there's no silver lining. These bills, the onslaught of these anti-trans bills this year has just been absolutely horrendous and painful. And, but I think that there are two things about it that I think give us an opportunity. The first is that having an opportunity to educate folks about what it means to be a trans youth, right? We may not have picked the framing of this conversation, right? We're doing this because these are the bills that the opposition is putting in front of us, but the opposition is telling lies about what it means to be trans. And so what that means is it's our job to go out there and explain to people, what does it mean to be a trans kid? What does it mean to transition when you are 7? What does that mean? How is that the same as transitioning when you're 30? How is it different from transitioning when you're 30? And it, I think, is giving us an opportunity to really tell people more of the story about what it means to be trans. The reason our opposition is going to this particular place is because they know that even well-meaning people don't have all of the information they need to truly be supportive in this moment. And so that's telling us that's where we have to go. We have to go and educate folks so that they understand there is no reason to be afraid of the kind of medical treatment that a 7-year-old trans kid is receiving, right? And it's giving us an opportunity to say, like, this is a social transition. We're not talking about surgery. We're talking about, eventually we'll start talking about puberty blockers, and that's the pause button that you all seem to be so desperate to find. And we know exactly what it is. The doctors are already doing all of this stuff. They already know what to do. There's no reason to fear. And we can now give you the information you need. And I think the same thing is true around the sports question, right? Which is like, trans kids have been playing sports alongside their peers in many, many states for many, many years. Trans folks are allowed to participate at the Olympics. They're allowed to participate at the college level. There's been no takeover of women's sports. This is all just harmful, stereotypical rhetoric, which also has, I think, a really important race layover when we're talking about, in particular, the folks who are put forward as being the threats to women's sports, not only trans, but are also Black. I think that's a really important part of where our opposition is landing. So the first thing is that it's giving us an opportunity to really get out there and do education of the media, do education of the general public who maybe just doesn't have a lot of information about what it means to be a 9-year-old trans kid, right? So we have that opportunity. The second thing is that I think this desperation that we see on the part of our opponents is a sign that we are winning. They are desperate to try to figure how to claw back LGBTQ equality. And so, as I mentioned, they started working on marriage, trying to prevent marriage, trying to poke holes in marriage. That didn't work. They pivoted to trans adults. That didn't work. They've pivoted to trans kids. They understand that they're losing. They know that they're losing. And they're desperate to figure out what is the thing that they can do that will make people afraid, so that equality doesn't continue moving on the incredible trajectory that it has been moving, right? We have to win over people's hearts. We have to win over people's minds. We have to change the laws. Those things are all happening at different paces, but they are happening much more quickly than our opposition knows how to get their arms around. And so this is kind of, in some ways, I don't want to say it's their last stand, but this is their big desperate effort. And I think what that shows us is that what we're doing is working, that we are winning, and that this is incredibly painful. It's incredibly difficult in this moment. And I do not want to skate past that, because I think it's really important to acknowledge and sit with. And in the scheme of things, I think it's showing us that the arc is bending.
Yeah. It really is. And I know that, Lisette and the hundreds and hundreds and probably thousands of parents of LGBTQ kids, and especially parents of trans kids who have been public, who've come out to testify in state capitals, who've written publicly about the impact of these bills on their families, and young people like Daniel. And Daniel, I think today, is speaking for the first time publicly and talking about changing hearts and minds. It's when we hear from young people like Daniel about, walking through the halls of school and wanting to play basketball, just makes people pause and think about, is this really what we want to be doing to these young people? So I appreciate that. And Jason, let's talk a little bit about the courts, not the basketball courts, but courts of law. So what's your general outlook on how things taking shape in the courts would affect, would sort of be leveraged in attacks on trans youth, and then anything you want to mention about what might be happening at the state and federal level as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think speaking honestly, the outlook in the courts is mixed, and I think a lot has been said and written and reported on just about how much damage the former president and the cadre of folks who support him politically did to remake the federal judiciary. Lots of very, very ultra conservative judges at the district and circuit court levels who don't really, who it doesn't appear really care much about the rule of law. I mean, look, the upside is that the law is on our side, whether we're looking at equal protection and sex discrimination, whether we're looking at due process and privacy and the ridiculous ways some of these laws invade long-standing legal relationships, parent to child, doctor to patient. And certainly what the Supreme Court had to say, at least in the workplace context in Bostock last year, and in the ways in which other areas of law, like sex discrimination in schools, like non-discrimination in healthcare, really take their clues and keys from workplace protections that we've had for decades. So we have law to work with. We know it's an uphill battle in some places, especially in the federal courts. So we've got to be really strategic and thoughtful about how we bring these cases, sometimes asking for more narrow relief than we otherwise would have. But there's a playbook, and we're following it, and our responsibility is to be smarter than the folks on the other side of that table about where we're litigating, what claims we're bringing, and the runway we see in terms of what it's going to take, and to be very patient and disciplined about not wanting to take necessarily the entire bite out of the burger every time we bring a case, but really setting up a strategy that's going to serve us in the most challenging places in the long run. And I'll say, I think we're also instigating a federal government that knows it needs to take a step up, a big step up, in utilizing all of its enforcement powers. I was encouraged to see them bring a case against the entire state of Texas last week. I think they can step up and do more, and it's our responsibility to let them know that that's our expectation as communities, as we look at the same exact bill showing up state after state after state. What is our federal enforcement apparatus if it doesn't step up for the citizens of this country when their state seems to want to take fundamental rights away? So we have that angle as well. And, I think for us, I think there's a lot of lawyers, myself and Kate have been in the practice for a while, but aren't necessarily super senior. We're kind of in that role of how do we utilize this training and maybe the experience we have in new ways. And I think encouraging folks, maybe like the two of us and others who are similarly situated, to think about going onto the bench at the state level, running for judge, making folks who have this lived experience kind of get up there and decide to be the decision makers. We've got work to do in that area, but I'm really encouraged that we're not accepting the judiciary as it is. We're pushing both on the outside to reshape it, and we're working with what we have to bring smart strategic litigation and to make sure we leave none of these bills unchallenged, but that we do it in a way that doesn't make the fights we have going forward harder. And I just will say one more thing about one particular tactic that we're really paying attention to, and that's this idea that these folks are going to use the public to enforce these laws, that they're going to take a step back after they've created all this harm and say, we're going to incentivize neighbor to turn on neighbor. We're going to incentivize teacher to turn on student, colleague to turn on colleague. And I'll say, one, the work that all of you're doing is going to reject that practicality and reality, and they're going to get egg on that face for that. But I will say, too, that we've seen things like this before. We have a case called Shelley v. Kramer, where folks in states try to use private real estate contracts in the enforcement of racially restrictive covenants to keep Black people out of communities, to sort of supplement and enforce redlining. We've seen them try to sidestep responsibility for these kinds of things, and we've been successful. And so is it going to be a long, maybe circuitous battle sometimes? Yeah, but to Kate's point, we're still going to bend that arc in the courts too, and it's because of folks like Lizette and like Daniel who aren't going backwards, who are going to live forward, and for whom we're going to be there for.
That is for sure. Daniel, maybe you'll be a federal judge someday. We'll see. I don't know if I know you're quite the artist too, so you've probably got lots of ideas. So Daniel, let's hear a little bit more from you, just a little bit more of your story and what it was like to sort of share with others your trans identity, and if there's any sort of advice you would give to other young people who are kind of exploring and emerging as trans or non-binary young people?
Okay, well, in third grade is when I socially transitioned, and so during that time between third and fifth, it was kind of hard to be super open about it, because by fifth grade I was bullied. So by sixth grade, I wasn't out at all to really anybody at school. But once I saw my friend Jay LeMay advocate for himself at the HRC CNN town hall, or presidential town hall, I just I wanted to feel empowered like he did. And so by that time is when I started being or advocating for myself more and being more open. And so by that, and with that, a lot of my friends aren't out at home, but it's easier for them to be out at school. And a lot of my friends who aren't out at home usually say that I wish I had your mom, or I wish I had parents like yours. And so maybe seeing me be out, supported by my parents, and safe and safe in school will help their parents see how easy it can be to affirm their kid and make their lives better when we have our parents support and love us.
Wow. Well, Lisette, I'm sure your heart jumps a bit to hear Daniel say that he's so aware of what having a supportive family means. And I know you run support groups with parents. You talk to parents all over the country. What are some of the common questions you hear from parents and common concerns, especially related to their children at school and navigating school?
Well, for us in Arizona, a lot of what I will say is 90% of parents will say, I'm afraid. And I think this goes back to this idea of understanding that bias and discrimination exists at a personal level and at a policy level. And so parents, when their kids first come to them, they're afraid for their child's well-being, afraid for their safety, understanding that their opportunities will now be limited. We are in a red state that has turned blue, but we're still red. And so a lot of, for us in Arizona, it's around identity documents. It's around being supported in school just by being able to use pronouns and your name, your chosen name, regardless of whether you've legally changed it or not. And I find that it's most of the challenges that parents of trans youth face is the ability to exist publicly in public spaces. Can you go to the doctor safely? Can you go to the dentist? What do you do when at the time when Daniel socially transitioned, like how did we, deal with relationships and play dates? And these are things that I didn't have to navigate before. How do you deal with summer sports when you have to present a birth certificate and the state obstructs you from being able to access one that shows an accurate gender marker, right? And so I think that really what we see with our trans youth is the ways in which policy marginalizes people, transgender people, out of public life. And so it's frustrating. It's a frustrating experience. It's frustrating to imagine my child having to navigate that alone, like many children do. Many have to wait until they're 18 because they're not supported by their parents. And so what I've made my sort of life's purpose is supporting other families and saying, like, here's a map forward. Here's how we can help each other make it to the next step of whatever that looks like for you. Here's how to make school safer. These are pragmatic, practical things that we can do to make life safer for our kids. And I will say that there's a resiliency that I see in parents, even when they're getting pushback from the schools. And so politicians, lobbyists, hate groups, they may have a lot of time and money to create these policies, but we have the love of our kids and their well-being at the forefront of everything we do, and we'll keep pushing. I mean, I've seen parents step up in ways that I never imagined, and I think we'd move mountains if we needed to. And so it's an interesting space to be in. I think politicians try to minimize the experience by saying it's just a piece of paper, it's just this, it's just that. But coming from an immigrant background, I'll tell you that legal documents are not just a piece of paper, right? They are the thing that allow you to work, live, and thrive. And it's the same thing for trans people. And so we really have to start connecting the dots. We have to start showing that our children are just children, our trans loved ones are just people who want to succeed and have all the opportunities that their community members would have. And so, yeah, that's a lot, but parents we're trying to do it. We're trying to be creative. We're trying to work within the constraints we're given. And hopefully one day we'll live in a country that will have the Equality Act, and we won't have to work so hard to keep our kids safe.
Here, here. We are all working toward that goal. Kate, so this is pretty much on topic here. In the most practical terms, what are some ways that folks listening can support families like Lisette and Daniel?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think just open your heart and ask questions. If you don't understand what it means to be trans, then ask questions. And don't feel like you have to ask Daniel questions. There are lots of people who are out here in the world who are willing to answer your questions who are not trans youth themselves, right? So you do not have to go to the person who's most impacted and ask them to do the education for you. There are lots of people who can help you. You can go on the internet. You could do research. There's so many. On HRC's website, we have a lot of resources. There are lots of resources out there. Just learn more. Open your heart. Learn more, and think about, and Lisa, your comment about parents moving mountains is so true, right? I mean, the reason that we're winning, despite the fact that the opposition has all of this money and all of these resources and all of this time and all of this, is because we have the humans on our side. And when we're telling the story about humans, we win. Right? Because the other side, this is about politics. And for us, it's about people, it's about hearts, it's about minds, it's about real folks. And I think that we win when that's centered. So I think for people who want to get more involved from a political standpoint, make sure that you're following HRC on all of your favorite methods of social. We will certainly let you know when there's an action to be taken in your state. For right now, most state legislatures are out. There are some legislatures that are real year-round that are still in. Texas will be back with its third special session shortly. And we have other states that are going to be doing special sessions as well this year to deal with redistricting and other things. So we may still need you this year. We'll definitely need you next year. So please make sure that you're signed up to be getting information from us, whether that's via our email list, whether it's via social, whatever. And we will make sure that we're communicating to you when we have actions that we need you to take. Contact your legislators and whatnot. And then also, as I said, please just be open-minded, understand that there are things that you don't know, let your heart lead you, and find out whatever it is that you need to know. Don't let the opposition make you afraid of kids. They're kids, and they have grown-ups like Lisette who love them, and we are out here to make sure that we are able to do that education for folks. So please make sure that you're doing the education, you're letting your heart lead you, and that you're taking all of the actions, which we will very helpfully provide to you if you sign up for all of our lists.
Thank you, Kate. Jason, do you have some final thoughts or a final message, especially for students and family members who are tuned in with us?
Yeah, I think two quick things. Both will be reinforcements of things I've said previously. But one is there's a lot of uncertainty, and I think a lot of questions that we don't have a lot of answers to that we're going to have to figure out together. And so I just invite everyone to know that at least here at the Human Rights Campaign, and I think I can speak for so many of our partners and collaborators across the country. We're going to be here for you to help you navigate those questions. Don't hesitate to ask them. You don't have to go through this period of uncertainty on your own. That's why we're here, and we're grateful to be able to show up for you. So it's about the big cases that we've brought. That's a piece of the impact and impact litigation, but it's also about those everyday questions of how do I get from Monday to Tuesday to Wednesday to Thursday to Friday, and we're going to be here for all of those. And the second thing I think is just that there's a lot of love out there, and it's okay to kind of make that cry, that plea for help. We know that folks are hurting, and whether it's to answer legal questions, whether it's to get resources, whether it's just to tell someone your story on the other side, I think that the most simple thing that we can do is actually be here for people. And we know that it's going to take just a lot of that basic human to human interaction for us to get through this school year and be ready for whatever, we may be presented with as a community. So I'll say that in respect, I'll say that in love, and I'll say that in solidarity.
Love that. One of my favorite t-shirts is a Love Conquers Hate shirt. I always get compliments on it too. Lisette, do you want to have a final message perhaps to the parents who tuned in?
Yes, I want to say that loving your child and affirming and supporting them will change their quality of life. It will affirm them and help them show up in the world in a strong and confident way. And it may not happen overnight, but when it happens, you have moments like this when I'm really proud of my kid for being on a panel for the first time with me. I also want to say that I'm just so grateful to the Human Rights Campaign, to Ellen, Jason, and Kate for doing this work, because let's face it, I'm just a mom and I can't do it alone. And I think that that's how all the parents across this country feel. We can't do it without you all. And so thank you for doing this work and for uplifting our children and for giving them a voice. It's so important, because all we want for our children is for them to be able to be their best, fullest selves, and you all help make that happen. And so thank you all for letting us be here today, and thank you to the Human Rights Campaign for all the work you've done the last 6 years to support our families.
Thank you so much, Lisette. And Daniel, we'll have you perhaps give the final thoughts, especially to younger people who might be listening.
No.
I'm trying to mute.
Oh, sorry.
Well, I have one more for like schools.
Great.
Okay. Well, I would just say to keep the classroom environment like safe. Like even doing like the bare minimum makes like all the difference, especially for kids that aren't out at school. Like I see that a lot of my friends have a specific teacher that they favor, because this teacher had asked all the kids on the first day what their pronouns were, what their name was, or what name they should be using for it, and then also to advocate for other students who might be getting bullied for their identity, or just bullied alone, which could just is cool. Just to make it safer for people, instead of just making it safer for
one person.
Yeah, for one group of people.
I really love that. Thank you for the reminder that even with the best laws and policies in place, if every adult who works in the school has to think about their own actions and behaviors and what they say and do in the classroom, whether it's using the right pronoun, using inclusive language, or interrupting bullying, and making sure students know that there isn't any room here for any kind of bias, including bias against LGBTQ kids. So thanks for that great reminder. And I thank all of you for this great conversation, especially Daniel, who I know you missed some school. Hopefully this wasn't like too much like a classroom where you're listening to the adults drone on about, contemporary issues or something. But we really enjoyed hearing from you. We appreciate it. And if you want to get more involved specifically in showing your support for trans youth, you can visit hrc.org/countmein and learn a lot more. Again, thanks for tuning in, and thank you for your support of trans youth across the country.